friends. The best way to welcome you all. I have the honour of being the companion to Dawn for this afternoon's book launch.
My sister in crime.
Sister in crime. That's right. And as I know that all of you are loyal fans of Dawn, it probably means I don't need to give you an introduction to this grand lady.
Goodness.
But what I will share from the introduction that I had prepared is that Dawn probably is the epitome of the trailing spouse who has reinvented herself. Roger, you can take the blame or the credit for that. Because as we know, Dawn has had the opportunity to explore the world as Roger's companion, and perhaps in our questions later we will find out how much that has influenced the story that she's told in her latest book. Now, I really enjoyed every one of your straights for today. And constant question for about a year and a half was, when was the final one coming? The English Concubine, because we had the pleasure of listening, reading, enjoying the first three in fairly quick succession. But Dawn, we waited a while for the English Concubine, and it seems like a fairly short time later we have the pleasure of a crowd of twisted things. So I hope you're going to be able to explain to us how you made us wait for an English Concubine, and then you delivered us the wonder of a crowd of twisted things so quickly.
That's easily done.
That's easily done. So Dawn has some stories to tell us, and before she starts telling us the whys and the wherefores of her latest book, I want to let you know that just last night in Melbourne, she was awarded the Sisters in Crime Award, Athenaeum Library Award, called the Scarlet Stiletto Awards in Melbourne, for her short stories. So, one of her many short stories won this award last night. So she continues to excel in her reinvented craft as a writer. And the beginning of that craftsmanship that I am connected to is the Friends of the Museum Writers Group. And when I met Dawn in 2006, she was one of the writers writing for the Friends of the Museum newsletter. She was one of the writers who was getting edited and requested to change her prose by our good friend Susan Hunter.
Oh no, poor Susan!
And I would suggest that Dawn didn't take too much notice of Susan Hunter's advice, as she developed a very, very fine style for her own writing. But I had the great pleasure that the first chapter of The Red Thread was read in my living room on one of the occasions that the Friends of the Museum Writers Group was together. So that is my special connection to my adopted sister Dawn, that I was in the audience that heard the first hearing of the first chapter of The Red Thread. So Dawn, would you be so kind to tell us why the heart of the story?
Absolutely, thank you, Roseanne. Roseanne's very modest, actually. The Friends of the Museum's Writers Group is an incredibly interesting and very, very valuable outlet for me to learn to write and to do writing and to have a very friendly audience for one's beginning writing, because that's the hardest part, is to dare to put things out there for people to criticise or to dislike or whatever it is that they want to do. It's quite a brave step, so thank you, Roseanne, very much indeed. Just briefly talking about why I this book and the last book in the Straits Quartet. I actually finished this book before the English Concubine, but because the Monsoon, the publisher, wanted to produce the 4 books before introducing a completely different type of book, then so the English Concubine, there was a long delay between finishing editing and processing that book before he turned to this book. So it's a question of publishing details and things like that, because this has nothing to do with the Straits Quartet. It's an entirely different era, an entirely different book. I'm sorry to bury my face in a bit of a page here, but I thought I might give you a little bit of background to what this book is about. This was a very important book to me because I wanted to touch on the 1950s in Singapore and the Maria Hertog story. And I don't know how much you know of the Maria Hertog story, probably a bit here and there, or maybe a lot, I'm not sure. So I'll start with what was going on in my head when I started to research this book. So essentially, in late 1949, 4 years after the end of the war, a British administrative officer went to a sports day in a village in Malaysia and noticed an unusual Muslim girl. Despite being dressed like any other Muslim child, she was taller than the other girls and her skin was very white. On making inquiries of the local Malay officials, he was told she was called Nadra bint Marof, the adopted daughter of Aminah bint Marof, the widow of a well-off jeweller. Well, this was an unusual occurrence, obviously. When he reported this back to his officers in charge, it came to light that she was almost certainly the child of a Dutch couple, Adeline and Adrianus Hertog, who had been searching for this little girl since the end of the war. And thus began all the trials of everyone concerned in this sorry tale. The child known as Nadra, but whose Dutch name was Maria, the foster mother Aminah, and the Hertog family, and of course the singular victim of this story was Singapore itself. The custody battle over this 13-year-old girl caused enormous publicity and anger on both sides of the religious divide between the Muslim Malay factions and the Christian Dutch. Maria became the football in a religious and political battle, and in the end everyone emerged as victims, and Singapore was sent into a riot of flames and a toll of 18 dead and almost 200 injured. Never mind the monetary value of the damage that was done. So what was Singapore in the 1950s? What was going on in Singapore in 1950? Well, it was in a very volatile state. It was emerging from the devastation of the Japanese occupation, with widespread overpopulation, poverty and dislocation. Malaya was caught up in the bloody emergency, with the British fighting the Chinese communists, and Singapore was in a ferment of political change. We're right on the cusp of almost independence, with all the political ferment that's going on behind the scenes. The special branch of the British police forces had sweeping powers of arrest and detention. Never to be forgotten in this period is how powerful the special branch were in arresting anybody that they felt was involved in communist insurrection at that time, and that features a little bit in this book. So this is the background that I chose to tell the story of Annie Collins, a young Eurasian woman who returns to Singapore in early 1950, searching for the child her Australian husband gave away as the Japanese came marching down Bukit Timah Road. He gave away the daughter, and he tried to murder her by feeding her an overdose of sleeping pills. So that's more or less the way the story begins. Obviously he didn't manage to kill her, or we wouldn't have any story at all. We follow the story of Maria Hertog through Annie's search and the reporting tasks of the man she enlists to help her. It is 1950, remember. We always need a man on the scene somewhere. And this one is Charlie Ransom. Fortunately, he's a young man, a young cub reporter for the Melbourne Mercury in Singapore. Now, at that time, Singapore had ceased to be of much interest to the major news organisations of the world. And Charlie's really there to shut up shop. The emergency, the Malayan emergency, was underreported outside of Malaya. The British were not interested in what was going on in Malaya at this time. They just got out of a world war. They were sick to death of war, and it was very underreported. And in any case, let's remember, by 1950, the whole world's eyes turned towards the outbreak of war on the Korean Peninsula. So we were back into war again. So Annie begins her search by seeking out the former servants of her husband, in particular the woman her daughter, Susie, my daughter is over there, Susie, aged 2 months, was given to. She and Charlie, along with the trusty chauffeur and increasingly her true friend, the Sikh driver Mahmood, talk to an old Malay man who is living along with hundreds of others in her former residence in Tanglan. Now, anyone who lives in Tanglan will recognise the Tanglan area from the book. There's no question about that. Lots of people live in Tanglan in this story. Somewhere along the way of this return to the past, Annie starts to have strange daydreams and odd recollections about her own past, which lead her down a path she is reluctant to follow, but which increasingly points to her less than savoury involvements with the Japanese during the occupation. So memories are emerging as she's searching for this child about her own past activities during the occupation with the Japanese. Before I reveal too much of the fictional story, let me go to the true story of Maria Hertog. In this book, the story of Maria is revealed like you would read it in a newspaper. As today, the stories unwind as we watch them on television and each event follows each event. I've tried to do that. Throughout each chapter of the book, you get a little bit more of the story as people would have got it as they were reading the newspapers of the time. So Maria Hertog was born in March 1937 to a Dutch Catholic family living in Bandung in Java, part of the Dutch East Indies at that time. Her father, Adrianus Hertog, was a sergeant in the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army. He married Adeline Hunter, a Eurasian brought up in Java in the early 1930s. Now, by 1942, when the Japanese are knocking on the door of Dutch East Indies, they had 5 children, and Adeline was pregnant with her 6th child. So this is not a very happy time to be pregnant with a 6th child in 1942. Maria was the 3rd and youngest daughter. That's important in this story, that she's young and that she was a daughter. When the Japanese invaded, Adrianus Hertog was sent to a POW camp in Japan, where he stayed until 1945, and he was a very sick man when he returned to the Dutch East Indies. Adeline Hertog stayed with her mother, and on the 29th of December 1942, Mrs. Hertog gave birth to a boy. 3 days later, Maria went to stay with Amina, a 42-year-old Malay friend of Adeline's mother from Terengganu in Malaya. Now there's no dispute about that part. This is where everything differs. From this moment, there are never 2 versions of the story the same. Adeline claims she sent Maria temporarily to stay with Amina whilst she recovered from the birth of her son. Amina claims she was given away to her permanently to be raised as a Muslim child. So you can see there's a vast gulf in what they both decided was the story after the war. And this is discussed a lot in this book through the various characters, because this was a huge talking point in Singapore. You and I would have been sitting around a coffee table discussing the Maria Hertog story. Did she, didn't she, what went on, and all this kind of stuff. Adeline claims she was interned sometime after demanding the return of Maria, a fact that Amina always disputed. In any case, the 2 women lost contact with each other when Amina and her husband moved to Jakarta. In 1945, Adrianus Hertog returned a sick man. An investigation about the whereabouts of Maria was set in train with the Red Cross, the various repatriation agencies and the local police. The Hertog family returned to Holland with no results to continue the search from there. In 1947, during the Indonesian national struggles, Amina left with her family and returned to Malaysia, to Terengganu. At this time, Maria was an entirely Muslim child. She spoke only Malay, wore Malay clothes, and practiced her religion very devoutly. Later, Maria would talk of this time as the happiest of her life. So we can assume that Amina loved her and took good care of her. Amina was offered money to give up Maria, $5,000 at the time in 1950, a big amount of money. She refused and was horrified when it was reported in the press in Holland that she had actually considered taking money for this little girl. In fact, the treatment of Amina throughout this entire episode is abominable. She's treated as the sort of local maid. She's an educated woman. She spoke Japanese. She was the wife of a diplomat. She was an extremely interesting and educated woman, and yet she's treated always as the ama, essentially, throughout this entire thing. Nevertheless, Amina was persuaded by this British administrative officer into going to Singapore to effectively regularise the adoption of Maria. This is clearly a lie. It gets her to Singapore, however, where she finds she's stuck. She realises her mistake, but there's not much she can do about it at this point. Discussing with the Dutch consulate led nowhere as far as she was concerned about giving up Maria. So she was adamant about keeping her, and the consulate applied to the High Court to remove Maria to the Social Welfare Department. So to take her out of Amina's care and put her into the care of the state. This was done despite Maria's violent objections and wishes to stay with Amina. Subsequently, the High Court gave custody of Maria to the Hertogs. Now, it was a talking point that Maria would automatically be given back to the Hertogs. This was never, ever thought in Holland, for example. The newspapers are very, very adamant about this at the time. That clearly this is a white child, she belongs with her white mother, and all this. But this doesn't turn out quite as clearly as it seems to be to them at that time. The horrible scenes which followed, the crying child clinging to Amina, visibly upset, screaming they would kill themselves rather than be separated. Now, this was all in the newspapers and photographs. The press was fully involved in all these activities of this case. So these photos were going overseas and throughout the world. A commotion blew up and the crowd grew very angry and excited. Finally, the child was removed to the girls' welfare centre, pending Amina's appeal through her lawyers, because at this point the Muslim community had banded together in order to form a fund to fight this business. There was a very, very strong feeling in the Muslim community that this child is a Muslim girl. She should remain with her Muslim mother, adopted mother. This increasingly it drew attention from the Muslim newspapers all over the Muslim world, not just in Malaya, all through Saudi Arabia, throughout the Muslim world, in Indonesia. This was a huge, huge story. And an appeal was set up to which a large amount of money began to pour in. So thousands and thousands of dollars are pouring into Singapore to support this Nadra fund. So in this book, this is the point where Annie arrives back in Singapore to look for her daughter. Now, if Maria had returned to her parents at this point, maybe there might have been few international repercussions. It's possible. But then there's a big coup d'etat. The appellate court finds minor legal irregularities in the Dutch consulate's case, some legal points. And Maria is handed back to Amina. She's removed from the social welfare department and goes back to the foster mother. And this drew massive and violent reaction from the Hertogs, from the government of Holland, from the people of Holland. Very huge case blows up in Holland about this. It went from essentially being a rather unusual domestic legal wrangle to an international media scandal, attracting attention from all parts of the world. Now, particularly inflaming at this point was the marriage of Maria. At this point, aged 14, Maria is quickly married to a 22-year-old Muslim man, 4 days after the return of the girl to Amina. So this was seen as a very cynical ploy to stop Adeline getting her child. As the marriage was never consummated, she was 14 actually there, she was probably 13 at the time, and she lived with Amina. Now this polarized opinion in the Muslim and non-Muslim world. In fact, the Laycock bill, this bill that comes in for the lower age of marriage, comes in on the back of the Maria Hertog story. The children under the age of 16 cannot be married in Singapore without, even if their parents wish it. So this brings in a whole new law into Singapore about underage marriage and all this kind of thing. And this becomes a massive thing in the press as well. So, in the novel, Charlie Ransom now sees his chance as a reporter. Suddenly he's got a big story going. And I'm married to a reporter, and I know they love the big story. So. The Hertogs continued the case since Maria was an infant, claiming their guardianship of her, and the affair dragged on in the press, the Muslim press, increasing in the stakes at every moment. Adeline Hertog was flown to Singapore to speak to her daughter, again attracting huge media attention. The crowds gathered, anger festered. The court ruled the marriage invalid on the grounds of her minority, and custody was granted to the Hertogs by the court on the grounds of the non-approval of her natural father. No matter whatever Adeline and Amina claimed or had agreed to in Indonesia, it meant nothing to the court because he, as the father, had never agreed to have his daughter adopted away. So she was returned. And here comes the big, awful mess that all this begins. because instead of going to be taken in by the Social Welfare Department, a neutral government child welfare agency, she is returned to the convent of the Good Shepherd in Thompson Road. Now this became enormously criticised after the event. At the time, there was a lot of, I looked in the record, and there was nothing in the newspapers much about it, but behind the scenes, the chief of police was saying, probably not a good idea to send her to a convent. Already Muslim feeling is quite inflamed, and this is probably, this was completely ignored by the government. Never mind, the mother has decided, and so on. So, let's look at what the political situation of the time was there at that time. The rise of post-war anti-imperial rebellion was in full force. India had achieved independence just 3 years before, in 1947. The Indonesians had just fought a long and bloody armed struggle with the Dutch for independence, which was achieved in 1949. The People's Republic of China were in power in 1949, backing North Korea in an invasion of the South. And the Chinese communists in Malaya were fighting a war of attrition with the British. 1950 was a very volatile period in Asia, with power struggles emerging on all sides. In Southeast Asia, voices which would never have been heard before the war emerged in force, particularly among the Muslim newspapers. Just as the coverage of the affair in the newspapers in Holland intensified feeling over there, the lurid coverage of the affair by the Malay and Indonesian newspapers intensified Muslim disaffection and belief in colonial bias against Islam. This had a particular effect on Muslim members of the Singapore police force, asked to defend the colonial state against the communists whilst witnessing what they saw as unfair treatment. During the ensuing riots, they stood by and watched violent acts of murder and destruction being perpetrated without intervening. A lot of this reporting was, why did the Malay police force do nothing as it all happened? Now, the colonial authorities clearly acted without the slightest respect for the feelings of the greater Muslim population. The press was allowed full access to the convent and to Maria. Pictures of Maria with the Mother Superior in the convent, kneeling before the Virgin Mary, and so on, inflamed opinion to explosion point. It came when the judgment finally came down that Maria was to be returned to her parents. 3 days and nights of rioting followed. Very unusual to think about that in Singapore, isn't it? A curfew was imposed, but it took many more days for the event to calm, even after moderate Muslim voices called for it. So that is the present time background of this novel. But I wanted to, very importantly to me, was to examine the place of women in times of war. And a lot of this novel is looking back on the war years. Remember, we're just 5 years after the end of the war in Singapore, so it's a very hard time here. And the Japanese had completely destroyed Singapore's economy, and it was trying to rebuild. I wanted to look at it through the eyes of very different women from all races and backgrounds that Annie comes into contact with as she tries to reconstruct the trail of this child throughout the war years. So from the women's point of view, I wanted to talk about the particular experiences of war for women. Because on top of the violence and horrors of war generally, there is, of course, for women, the dreadful spectre of rape. Apart from the documented cases of indiscriminate rape during the occupation as the Japanese came into Singapore, there was the Japanese systematic policy of putting women into army brothels. This was so commonplace, now we know, but for many, many years this was never known. If they did not die of their abuse, sickness or suicide, women's post-war lives were hell. Many of them chose to block it out and never spoke of it for decades. And I think we know about the Korean comfort women, but there are many in Southeast Asia as well. This is not an isolated event. We're talking about thousands and thousands of women. So this is the emotional search for a lost child, the recollections of war by the many different types of racial women that were living in Singapore, the Muslim women, the Chinese women, and so on. An unfolding story of Annie's own wartime experiences, and increasingly her realisation that she is not a very innocent person in the wartime years, and the pain of post-war Singapore. That's what the book is about. So, what was Annie doing during the occupation? And does she find her child?
read the books by the end.
Thank you very much. I have to say that I will be at the Monday morning lecture for the Friends of the Museums next Monday, and I have been asked to mention that to you, and that my books will be on sale there as well. But I am also going to plug Mr. Baston's novels of the Wives of Sir Stamford Raffles, because the Monday morning lecture is about the wives of Sir Stamford Raffles, and my theory and my fervent aim is to convince you that he would not have been the man he was without his wives. So I hope to see you all there too.
So Dawn, you're not going to escape that easily.
Okay.
Thank you very much for wrapping that up so succinctly with an ad for Monday morning lecture. The audience, you have any questions of Dawn about why a new era in her writing, a new background setting for her writing, perhaps? Can you tell us, Dawn? Why you moved from...
I've switched from the 1860s of Singapore to the 1950s. It's a big gap, isn't it? I think just because if you look around, for an author, a dramatic period is very important. In a way, the Straits Quartet doesn't cover a tremendously dramatic period, I suppose, in Singapore's history, but just a sweep of what was going on during those years. Although there are riots here, there are racial riots, there are religious rioting going on even in those times. Actually, things haven't changed all that much because, you know, by the 70s, of course, when the present government of Singapore was here, they were desperate. The legacy of this period, this 1950s period, is immense in the government of Singapore today. Where we can see, for example, the laying down of very stringent press laws by the present government, which came to power. And the control of the press became very important on the back of the scandalous incitement to riot, basically, that was going on in the newspapers at the time. And the whole idea of racial integration, that it's a volatile mix, and you have to be very careful in a small place like this about that. And so inciting to riot and inciting to racial hatred, and, you know, obviously they were far ahead almost. You know, in Australia we didn't have those kind of laws for years and years, this idea that you couldn't incite to racial hatred. And I think Singapore was very quick off the mark with those laws coming in very stringently because of the volatile nature of Singapore society. So yeah, 1860, I jumped 100 years, but I think I jumped a little bit into a very interesting place. With my agent at present is another story called Living on Tokyo Time, which is about a young boy growing up during the war years in Tokyo, in Singapore, occupied Singapore. So I bridge a little bit of the gap with the war, but I wanted this to be post-war because it's such an interesting period in Singapore history. You know, the British are almost on the cusp of leaving. Things are very, very up in the air, and the new government's almost there, but not quite there. And actually what's interesting in a way was that the present government isn't quite on the scene here, 1950. And so in a way, one of the characters in the book is the man that the British are quite promoting to be the next leader of Singapore when they leave. And as it turns out in history, that doesn't turn out to be the case at all, of course, because we know that Lee Kuan Yew comes along with a whole different agenda, and it doesn't work. So it's quite an interesting period where things didn't quite they seem to be going in one direction, then they turn around and do something different. So I'm very interested in this period. It's a very interesting period in Singapore.
So Dawn, you talk about the fact that you chose a dramatic period in history. How different was your research process when you are looking at the 1860s as your setting and the 1950s as your setting? I mean, you're famous for spending hours in the library. How different was your research for the background for this story in comparison to your Straits Quartet?
Well, I mean, it has to be slightly different, doesn't it? Because, I mean, although there are anecdotal stories of the earlier period, I mean, 100 years ago, we're getting anecdotal stories, we're getting a few letters, there are newspapers, of course, and so on and so forth. But for this period, it's a much more intensely in the newspapers. What's going on in the newspapers at the time, which is giving me a tremendous feel and sense of what's happening, what's being reported, how people are adjusting to that, and what the gossip is, essentially, because, you know, it's very gossipy. And especially something like this, it's two worlds colliding, really. And one of the points I make in this story is that the reason there's this massive desire by the Dutch to get Maria back is odd, because Maria, they paint her as white as tulips, as Dutch as tulips, this little white girl being corrupted by this awful life she's had to lead. But actually Maria's a Eurasian child. She's not as white or Dutch as tulips at all. And ordinarily the Dutch would have rejected Maria, probably intensely, had there been under other circumstances. But here they embrace her as this Dutch child. And the feeling is very much that they had just lost the Dutch East Indies. And by hook or by crook, they were not going to lose this kid, because she came to represent what they'd lost in 1949, which was the whole of their empire to a certain extent. So that she becomes this symbol of what we've lost, and we're not going to give in. So she becomes a football in the whole thing, definitely. Research-wise, yeah, just reading a lot about. There's a lot of stuff written about the 50s, so it's particularly the Hertog story is very, very interesting.
You have mentioned a couple of times this afternoon about racial harmony. I've noticed that you seem to enjoy having characters in your stories that are of mixed backgrounds and relationships between people of mixed backgrounds. Can you tell us why this is a common theme in your writing?
Well, it's interesting because now I'm in Australia, I don't quite think along those same lines anymore. But being in Singapore, it's such a natural thing to see, so many different races and cultures mingling and mixing. And Singapore's really a melting pot for that, isn't it? And so when I started writing, especially this book, I don't feel comfortable writing in the guise of a Chinese woman. I don't feel very comfortable writing as a Malay woman. I'm not those things. So a sort of best compromise is for me to write a little bit as an Eurasian woman, because I can sort of delve into the Eurasian side. I mean, Annie's really, really British. I mean, she's raised in a convent. She's taught how she hardly speaks Malay because they weren't allowed to, and that wasn't right. And so she comes from that sort of British background. She's also a bit lost because she doesn't really feel she belongs. She certainly doesn't belong in Australia, because when she goes to Australia, she feels the full force of racism in Australia like a bolt, because she's reviled for her skin colour, she's reviled for so many things, and it's the White Australia policies was in full force in the 1950s. I mean, she's fortunate to get in any case, because she only gets in because the aunt of her dead husband allows her to come and live with her, and because she actually has a marriage certificate to an Australian man. And in fact, the Australian man she's married to is more like a Brit, because he thinks everything British is absolutely marvellous. And of course, we Australians, we thought a bit like that for a very, very long time. We still think a little bit like that, and that's a worry. But yeah.
No comment from
We're in the process of building a quay in Western Australia, which is actually named after Queen Elizabeth, and I'm just horrified. I could have thought we'd have done better after all these years, but never mind. One of the novels I'm mooting at the moment is quite an anti-British, anti-war novel set in the outback of Western Australia. So I'm into that thing at the moment. But yeah, so poor Annie, she finds a hard life in Australia initially when she first gets there. But it's not really about her life in Australia. It's about what was she doing in the war. When she starts to discover, memories come back to her that she was doing something in the war when she thought she'd had an entirely different life, an entirely different, an honourable one as a prisoner of war. She finds she's not quite so honourable after all. So that's for her to discover as she goes through.
So one of the differences between this book and your First Straits Quartet is you have raised that theme of suppressed memory and self-delusion. What prompted you to do that, and what research did you do into the psychological behaviours of people who have suppressed memory?
Well, I didn't really do very much research into the psychological disturbance of repressed memory, I'm afraid. Sort of made it up as I went. Obviously, as an author, I wanted Annie to have a past that she doesn't recognise. That coming back to Singapore, ostensibly for one reason, which is to search, perhaps fruitlessly, for this lost child, will start to awaken in her other memories of a life that she doesn't even remember having lived. Now she has a wound, one of the reasons that she can't remember, I suppose, I've made it fairly, perhaps it's a little facile, but she has a wound, and she then has therefore no memory, and she thinks she's been a prisoner of war, and she only slowly discovers that that's not true, and therefore, what was she doing?
Does anyone in the audience have questions for Dawn? Have any of you read the book, or you're all about to write?
Any new strands in Singapore's history that you want to mine?
Yeah. Well, I've been
Maybe
asked.
not next book, but further on.
I don't know. As I say, I've written a book about a young man, a young boy, a 13-year-old boy who is turning 13 or more or less when the Japanese come to occupy Singapore. So he lives through the entire occupation of Singapore, growing to be a young man during that time. So it's a young adult, sort of coming of age novel. But I really wanted to address the idea of what the civilian population did during the war here. There's lots of stories about British women, not lots, but there are stories about the British experience of Changi, of being a prisoner of war, of how the British suffered, and that kind of thing. Almost no stories about what happened to the civilian population in Singapore during the entire occupation. It was 3.5 years or something, and that's a very long period, and it's very heavily documented. There's a lot out there to read about that period. So it's basically a story of a young boy who lives through the occupation, the good, the bad, and the evil, and how he copes with the things he sees that happen to him during. And if you want it, and it's based a lot on the verbal. I don't know if you know the British. The library here has a wonderful oral history department, absolutely amazing oral history department, and you can access it all online and listen to the stories of the civilians who had lived through the war. And so it's really a compilation of those oral histories, as you know, of course some of them were 13 and some of them were 14 and some of them were 20, and they were living through this war, and that the amount of things that I got, the research in it was very, very interesting for me. It's very rich, very, very rich indeed. So that's coming out.
Now that you're based in Australia,
Yes.
you're digging up
I am.
unknown facts of Australian history.
I'm digging up dirt in Australia. I am. Yes, I'm actually, my husband and I went off into the wilds of Australia not very long ago to research a book I'm writing about a returned soldier from World War I. The Australian government after World War I felt very horrified at the numbers of dead in Australia, because we suffered tremendously in the First World War. Another bone of contention to me was sending people across to fight a war far, far away, but it was very British in those days, and that's what you did. And an inordinate amount of young men died from the wheat belt of Australia, from the big farming plains of Australia. Didn't have very many men in the first place, but they sent their sons out. And when you go to the war memorials of the wheat belt, you can see the numbers, just the sheer numbers of young men who died from that area. So they gave a lot to the war. And so it's basically our returned soldiers coming back to what was on offer, what was the Australian government doing at that time. And what they were doing was offering land to people without much help, who didn't know how to farm. Banks were foreclosing. We're just on the border of the Depression. So that's also a very interesting period in Australian history, West Australian history. I'm mining a little bit for that at the moment.
Dawn, had you always intended to be a writer? Have you always dreamt of being a writer?
I always wanted to be a writer, and my husband stopped me.
Where is it?
And my children. I think life gets in the way, doesn't it? I know that there's a lot of women I've met here in Singapore, a lot of expatriate ladies who come to these writers' things and say, I've got a novel, I want to write, and I just say to them, it's really hard if you have a family, if you're married and you have young children, and famously you have to have time. You have to have time and space to write, and I'm at that age when my children had grown up, married and gone away and they were leading their own lives, when I found the opportunity really, and that was it, the opportunity to write. And Singapore was a great inspiration to me. But I have always wanted to write. Yeah, I suppose I never just put it away somewhere. And it all got to come out when I was here. And thanks to you, actually. Thanks to you. Thanks to the Friends of the Museums. Thanks to the guiding that I've done in the museums. Of course, the red thread is entirely the result of me guiding at the Friends of the Museums and guiding the ACM. So thank you very much, because actually that became the sort of inspiration to do that novel, definitely.
And that's such a thing with so many people from FOM that all of a sudden they have the opportunity to do something which
Yeah, it just blows your mind. You open it up, and there you go. Yeah, if you've got it in you, it sort of can come bubbling out. And I am grateful to. Where's Pansing? Where are you, Leslie? I'm grateful to Monsoon, and I'm grateful to Pansing, or the distributors here, for backing it. You need a publisher, otherwise nobody reads it. So thanks to them too. So yeah, all worked out very well in Singapore.
Dawn, we can't have a book launch without knowing about the title of the book.
All right. So of course it's a crowd of
Please explain.
when you write a book, I always have a working title of a book, which never ends up being the title of the book. So oddly enough, I don't know. This was called something about mothers and daughters or something like that. I don't know, just for me to work on when I was working on it. And then I started to think about what was it actually about. Well, what it's about really is about how war twists everything. How war and dislocation and violence and racism and mess twist your lives around, and that's what they do. They make, you only have to read anybody's story of how the war affected them, or any violent episodes. Only have to look at anything that's going on in the world today to know that families' lives are twisted up, children are twisted around. So basically it comes from a T.S. Eliot poem. I love T.S. Eliot, so he was actually talking about memory, which is also quite good, because her memory is faulty and twisted as well. And you can see that in the beginning, it's from a Rhapsody on a Windy Night by T.S. Eliot. The memory throws up high and dry a crowd of twisted things, a twisted branch upon the beach, eaten smooth and polished, as if the world gave up the secret of its skeleton, stiff and white. So it's basically events twist people around, and they twist your life up. And how do you untwist those things? So that's essentially why that's called that.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Well, please tell us what the future holds besides Libya on Tokyo time.
Right.
The story of the soldier returning from World War I to Australia, and
all right, then I'm going to plug our production company. My daughter and I and my elder daughter have a production company called Tempest Productions, and we have several documentaries and a film in the offing for next year, filmed in Western Australia. So we've.
Susie wants to
speak up. Speak up.
Susie, your turn on the stage.
No, my daughter Susie is a director on the stage. She's won prizes for her directing and for her productions on stage in Western Australia. And I do a bit of the writing. I do the writing, and my other daughter is the technical side of things. She does all the editing and the directing and the filmy stuff. So we decided that we'd come together and try not to fight over being a mother and daughter production company. So we'll see how that goes.
Roger has a very big smile.
No, he's all right. He stays out of it. So plenty to do in Western Australia at the moment. So it's been a happy return in a way. But I miss Singapore. I really do. So I'm very happy to be back here and see all of you. It's great.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dawn, for sharing your loves, your passions, and stories about your current and future writing. We're
Thank you,
very glad
Roseanne.
to have spent the afternoon with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.